I'm Jean Rourke from the Federal Reserve, and I'll be your facilitator. And our presenter is Economic Education Advisor Andrew Hill from the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. I'll move to slide 2 to cover our call logistics. To join our webinar, use the link you received upon registering. You may have noticed that the webinar tool offers the option to listen to the audio through your PC speakers or over the phone. The quality of the PC audio does depend on your connection, so at any time, feel free to dial into the bridge number. You can also resize your browser to make the slides larger. This call is being recorded, and the archive will be made available for use at a later date. And you can ask Andrew questions today. At any time during the session, you can type your questions using the Ask Question button on your screen. And one more note, you should keep your mouse handy as we'll be conducting a few polling questions. And when we do, just select your answer on the screen. But speaking of polling, let's try out a couple right here in the beginning. I'm going to pose our first polling question for you. I'll read the question aloud, and then I'll also read your options. If you would, just hold for one moment while that question comes up. Okay, that question should have popped up on your screen. And the question is, which of the following best describes your role? I'm a K-12 teacher. I'm a college instructor. I'm a Federal Reserve staff member. I'm a state person at a council or center for economic education, or I am none of the above. I'll give you a second to think about who you are, how it describes your role, and I will stop that poll and show the results to the group. And it looks like, as far as our results are concerned, it looks like most individuals are K-12 teachers at 93%, but we do have 7% of individuals who are college instructors. So very cool to note. All right, and let's keep the fun going, and I will launch our second polling question. And that should pop up on your screen very shortly. Okay, the question is, which early American wrote a treatise on paper money in 1729? So while you are thinking about that, actually let me give you the options, and then I will turn to some legal information. The options you have: Alexander Hamilton, William Bradford, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, or John Adams. So I'll give you some time to think about that, and I will read you our legal disclaimer on slide 3. Okay, the views expressed here are those of the presenters and do not necessarily represent the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia or the Federal Reserve System. I will go back to our polling question and stop that and show the results to our audience. Hopefully you've joined us in the webinar and you can see all of these fun things. All right, we'll get those results up. And it looks like 53% of our participants said the answer is Benjamin Franklin, and 34% said Alexander Hamilton. And I can't wait to hear from our presenter so that he can tell us what the correct answer is, as I do not know the answer to that. One more quick note before I turn it over to Andrew is you have to be logged into the webinar today in order to receive your professional development certificate. So please keep that in mind. And if you have not logged into the web already, you can find that link via when you've registered. So Andrew, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Jean, and welcome to everyone on the line. I want to share some really exciting things about resources that we have here at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia to teach about the first and second banks of the United States in your own classrooms, and share with you some additional information, some things you may never have known about these institutions. As you may know, both of them, their original buildings, their headquarter buildings are right here in Philadelphia, very close to Independence Hall, very close to the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. And each summer we have a Making Sense of Money and Banking week-long course here at the Philadelphia Fed, and we actually have a great opportunity to go over and do a tour of both of those institutions and get a chance to see a little bit behind the scenes in those two buildings and get a little sense as to how they operated. So let's start off talking about Benjamin Franklin, Philadelphia's native son. He came to Philadelphia in 1723, and he set up a printing operation, and one of his very first printed products was actually a treatise on paper currency and why it was necessary. So for those of you who picked Benjamin Franklin, you're absolutely correct. Jean, let's go to the next slide. So one of the things that Franklin is well known for, in addition to many of his exploits in science and in politics, was being a very excellent printer. And one of the things that he did do is print banknotes. So one of the things that he's famous for is inventing this process of using leaf patterns as a counterfeit deterrent device. So there's a great connection between Benjamin Franklin and the printing of paper money. Not only the publication that he did, but also the fact that he did print paper money himself. Let's go to the next slide. One of the things that you may not be aware of is that during the colonial period and in the period just after the start of the Revolution, different colonies, different states printed, whether it be paper money or it be bills of exchange, they printed them using different denominations. Pounds in the case of Pennsylvania, and Virginia was using dollars. And dollars really came from the Spanish mill dollar, which was used as legal tender in the United States all the way up until the 1850s. Let's go to the next slide. Back at the 300th anniversary of Benjamin Franklin's birth, which was about 10 years ago, the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia had a great lecture from Farley Grubb, a professor at the University of Delaware, and we turned that lecture into a publication called Benjamin Franklin and the Birth of a Paper Money Economy. So that publication is available in free class sets for you to use with your students. One of the exciting things about Benjamin Franklin is he pointed out a couple of things in that original treatise that he wrote in 1729. One of the things that he observed was what happened in a colony if there was too little money. So if there weren't enough coins, if there wasn't any paper money available, economic activity slowed down. And then he also observed that there were certain colonies, certain states that had printed a lot of money, and when they printed a lot of paper money, the result was inflation, too much money chasing too few goods. Jean, I think we should be on the next slide, on slide 7 at this point. It's not showing on my version of the webcaster. We also published a lesson to go along with that publication so that you can use the publication with your students and then do some activities. So there are some great text-based questions that are in there as a homework assignment that the students can do after they've read the publication, but also some activities for you to do in your classroom. One showing what happens if there's not enough money in circulation, and the other doing a classic inflation auction where you actually show the students what it's like if you have too much money chasing too few goods. I should point out that that little URL there at the bottom of the screen, and I'm going to show it a number of times, gives you access to a live binder that I've created. This is a free website where you can go and get access to all the materials that I'm talking about today. They're also available on our website, philadelphiafed.org/education, but I wanted to give you one concise place where you can go and get access to PDFs of these materials, as well as get access to some of the web clips that I'm going to talk about a little bit later on. Jean, let's go to the next slide. So just a couple of things in that lesson to show. We talk about the functions and characteristics of money, something that's benchmarked at relatively young grades in the economic standards, but nonetheless something we really need to review and ensure that students understand in high school. And then we do that inflation auction where we auction off a couple of items to the students, and we show what happens if you significantly increase the amount of money in circulation, which of course is inflation that happens. Let's go to the next slide. We also do an activity using these trading direction cards and commodity cards where you actually get the students engaged in seeing what happens to trade if you don't have enough money in circulation. This is a really fun activity. We've had a lot of success showing this to teachers, and then teachers have been able to take this back to their classroom and really illustrate some of the things that Benjamin Franklin himself saw when he came to Philadelphia in 1723. Let's go to the next slide. I've shown here on the right-hand side the reading guide that we created. Now, we created this before the advent of the Common Core, but it does a really great job of giving you some text-based questions that students then are going to get engaged in the publication, the print publication. One of the things you can do is to go to our website and order your free class sets of any of the publications I talk about today, and all the information for that is in the live binder. Let's go to the next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about what happened as we come out of the Revolutionary War period. There was a general shortage of money, in particular coin, that existed throughout the economy. The economy had been significantly adversely affected during the Revolutionary War. We didn't have this uniform currency, so we had the situation that I talked about before where some states were using a pound system, some states were using a dollar system. We also had both the federal government as well as state governments having huge outstanding war debts that they needed to pay off. And there were significant levels of bankruptcy and even potential destitution. The economy just had been so bad for so long. With westward expansion, then, the federal government also had to find ways to take in revenue from duties and land sales and then move those funds around the country. So there was a really significant need to improve the financial stability, really, of the economy. Let's move to the next slide. So the question then is, what was a country to do? And probably many of you are aware, it's Alexander Hamilton, our first Secretary of the Treasury, who has this idea: create a national bank, one that's built on the model of the Bank of England. But there are others within the new government, Jefferson in particular, who really opposed it and urged President Washington to veto the bill. So Washington had really called upon Jefferson as well as Hamilton and a couple of others to write letters to really describe to him what they thought he should do and to really argue the point. In the end, Hamilton won out, and Washington signs the bill that creates what we now know of as the first Bank of the United States. The first there is in parentheses to emphasize the fact that this is an institution that was named Bank of the United States. Let's go to the next slide. So Congress assumed the war debts of the individual states. Congress created the Bank of the United States to help refinance those debts. But a really important thing to note about this period of time was it was the only nationally chartered bank at the time, and there were only, at the time that it was chartered, only 5 state chartered banks in the entire country, so a very limited amount of banking available. Now, you might say, well, how did people in the period before this get access to credit? A lot of that would have been done through private financiers, not through banking institutions. So the first Bank of the United States, it held the federal government's deposits, it received its revenues, it made its payments, it even was responsible for doing this overseas, and we had in the historical record lots of correspondence concerning that. And it made loans to government, to individuals, and to businesses. Let's go to the next slide. It was a private institution. The stock traded publicly. Foreigners, by the end, owned about 70% of this institution. It had a very large capitalization of $10 million. It was one of the largest corporations in the country to that day. Like other banks, it made business loans, it accepted deposits, it issued notes that circulated as currency, and that were then convertible into gold and silver. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a while. But unlike the state chartered bank notes, the first Bank of the United States notes were valid for the payment of federal taxes, and for that reason, they tended to be preferred. The other thing is they were able to be used nationwide at par value. So $1 First Bank of the United States note was worth $1 everywhere. And it had a 20-year charter. Go to the next slide. We've created some really great video clips, and normally when I do this presentation live, I talk about those specific video clips or use those video clips and show them to you in the same way that you can use them with your students. So you can get easy access to these from our website. You can also get them on our YouTube site, which is youtube.com/PhiladelphiaFed. I've given you here also the direct link to the clip. And by the way, I should mention that the slides that we have are also available in the live binder, and eventually there will be at that YouTube channel the video of this exact webinar. So this is a great 4-minute clip that really talks about the founding of the First Bank of the United States, about how it operated, and its importance in the economy overall. Let's go to the next slide. Going along with that video clip, we've created a lesson that primarily focuses on the debate between Hamilton and Jefferson, but makes use of that video clip that I mentioned that's available on YouTube as part of our Federal Reserve and You project. So we created a video called the Federal Reserve and You that has 71 clips. So if you're teaching about anything in history of central banking, you're teaching anything about the Federal Reserve or money in banking, it's definitely a resource you want to check out. And again, there's our live binder link at the bottom of this screen. So I'm just showing you a screen capture here of what that lesson looks like. It's available in the live binders as well as on our website. So this is a great lesson for grades 6 to 12 to really introduce the whole idea of this debate between Hamilton and Jefferson around the founding of the first bank, as well as to get students to understand a bit about what it is that this institution meant to the economy overall. Let's go to the next slide. We also created a print publication, just like we have our Benjamin Franklin and the Birth of a Paper Money Economy print publication. You can also use the First Bank of the United States print publication. It was just reprinted, so we have plenty of copies available in free class sets that you can order off our website. And I actually have a more in-depth lesson that I've written about the First Bank of the United States that goes along with it. There's some challenging activities in this, but there's also a lot of really great things to explain to students how this bank operated. Let's go to the next slide. One of my favorite things that's in this lesson is actually a reader's theater that we did that really talks about it set in a coffee house, which you might say to yourself, well, you know, coffee, was that really around in the 18th century? Yes, coffee was an extremely important commodity, and the coffee house played a really pivotal role in the colonial and then early Federalist economy in terms of being a place where people would get together and debate topics, but also carry out financial transactions, exchange stock, etc. So anyway, the Reader's Theater is set in a coffee house and does a great job of explaining to the students what the economic conditions were like at the time that the First Bank was founded, as well as this debate that really is going on between the followers of Jefferson and the followers of Hamilton. Just like in the other lesson I mentioned, we have them looking at excerpts from those 18th century letters that Hamilton and Jefferson both wrote to President Washington, getting them identify which of the two they think that it is writing in these segments that I've taken out of those letters, and then actually rewriting them a bit into modern parlance. So a good activity for getting students to really be able to recognize who's making the specific argument, and also to read some 18th century language, which at times can be challenging. Let's go to the next slide. So some of the things we're doing in that activity, as I said, is looking at some of the quotes from specific individuals. And what I would normally do is set this up as a PowerPoint with some animation where I would ask you to read this quote and then identify for me who you think is actually the person who wrote this. In this case, this is Jefferson arguing against the First Bank of the United States. Let's go to slide 20. Here's one from Hamilton. The bill neither prohibits any state from erecting as many banks as they please, nor any number of individuals from associating to carry on the business, and consequently is free from the charge of establishing a monopoly. For monopoly implies a legal impediment to the carrying on of the trade by others than those to whom it is granted. So again, 18th century language is challenging, but I think it's good to get students engaged in reading that type of language and understanding what it takes to do this type of historical research. This, of course, is Hamilton really debating or refuting the argument that the founding of the Bank of the United States would keep states from being able to charter their own banks. Let's go to the next slide. And this is the last one that we have in this series. This is also Hamilton. So I won't read it to you there in the interest of time, but you get the idea, getting students to read these clips from those letters and getting them to identify which of the two is the person making the argument. And again, they can learn about who's making that argument either from the Reader's Theater, if you're using the paper lesson and the paper publication, or from the video clip that I mentioned to you. Let's go to the next slide. There are a number of really interesting artifacts that are left from the First Bank of the United States. I should mention that the ledger books from the First Bank of the United States are actually missing. They've never been able to be found. They're not in the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, which is one of the places where one might hope they would be, or in the Library Company of Philadelphia. But there are a lot of things that are left, and this actually is a check written by Thomas Jefferson while he was President of the United States, written to himself. You might say, well, why does it say Office of Discount and Deposit? That's actually the branch of the First Bank of the United States in Washington, D.C. So here's a person who opposed this bank, but actually in the end had to make use of it because it was the government's bank. Let's go to the next slide. These are some little clips that I've just taken out of the publication, the print publication on the First Bank of the United States, which is available in PDF on our website, but also you can order those class sets I talked about. Here's Alexander Hamilton writing a check, and a check in those days didn't have to necessarily be written on a check blank, could be written on just a piece of paper. So really exciting to be able to see this, and I've had the great opportunity. This is part of the Library Company's collection here in Philadelphia, and I've actually had the opportunity to hold this check in my hand, so a really exciting bit of history that I've been able to interact with. Let's go to the next slide. This is actually a couple of checks written on check blanks by Jonathan Dayton, who was the fourth Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. So these are some of the artifacts that we actually show in that First Bank of the United States print publication. Let's go to the next one. This is a check written by Pierre Charles L'Enfant, who, of course, is the original designer of Washington, D.C. So, again, really interesting to see the people, the actual leaders in our country who are making use of this bank. Let's go to the next slide. This one's very, very interesting. This is actually $5,100 counterfeit First Bank notes that actually were discovered in the territory of Louisiana. They come with this crummy-looking wrapper in which William Claiborne, the governor of the territory of Orleans, he sent this material, these counterfeit notes, back to Philadelphia to be turned into the home bank here in Philadelphia and to be deemed to be counterfeit. So these are also available in the historical record, and I've actually had this collection of notes in my hand. So really interesting that counterfeiting was going on back then, and really was an important thing that was being discovered in New Orleans. Go to the next slide. So we should mention just a little bit about the branches of the First Bank of the United States. So this was not an institution that was simply here in Philadelphia and nowhere else. It did have a reach significant reach beyond Philadelphia. So there were 4 branches that opened in 1792. Those were in Boston, New York, Baltimore, and Charleston. Gene, we should be on slide 27. I'm not seeing that one quite yet. Eventually, it had 8 branches from Boston to Savannah to New Orleans, and they were in Norfolk and Washington. And they were called, as I mentioned before, the Office of Discount and Deposit. Moving on now to slide 28. We have a map here that shows those locations. And so you'll notice that these are located in port cities. And why is that important? Well, these were going to be the financial institutions, that were heavily involved in the collection of tariffs. So a lot of the revenue that the federal government got at that time was through the collection of tariffs. But it's also important to note that the First Bank had a significant role also in the funding of westward expansion. So despite the fact that there might not be branches further west, the reach economically was significant. And so David Cowan, who's written an excellent doctoral dissertation on this, talks about the role that the First Bank played in funding westward expansion. Let's go on to the next slide. And, Jean, I think we actually have a polling question associated with this slide. So this is Carpenter's Hall here in Philadelphia. I have the great opportunity to live in this neighborhood and be able to walk by this building every day. This is actually the location of the Carpenters Guild, or there was their guild hall. And carpenters in the 18th century meant not just people who built buildings, but really architects as well, people who were engaged in the building of structures and designing of structures. So, Jean, let's bring up that poll.
All right, thanks, Andrew. I'll just announce that polling question and the options, and hopefully your participants will respond accordingly. So the question is, Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia is most famous as the location of the A, signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, B, First Continental Congress, which met in 1774, C, signing of the U.S. Constitution in 1787, or D, the first recorded bank robbery in U.S. history in 1798. I'll give you just a couple of seconds to think about your response prior to closing out our poll question. All right, give you just 1 or 2 more seconds. Okay, I'll stop that poll and show the results for the group. And hopefully those results will be popping up on our screen soon. I don't see our results, Andrew, so I will have to get back to you on what the, I'm sorry. I do have the results. Okay. It looks like 70% of our participants said they responded with B, which is the First Continental Congress, which met in 1774, and 22% of our respondents said D, the first recorded bank robbery in U.S. history in 1798. I'm not certain why those results aren't showing for you. I'm going to just try it one more time.
Well, those are both of events that actually happened in Carpenter's Hall. So, yes, the First Continental Congress met here in 1774. That's the thing it's probably most famous for. But it also was the location of the first bank robbery, or the first known bank robbery in the United States in 1798. And that's an important part of the story. You might say, well, why is this building, which is the Guild Hall for the Carpenter Society, why is it a location where a bank robbery would have taken place? Well, this is a building that was used over and over again as a location for banks. And the first bank in the United States actually started its operations in 1791 in this building. Later on, the 1798 robbery was actually the Bank of Pennsylvania at the time, and there's a whole great story that you can read out on the Internet about that. So it kind of did a little bit of a trick question on that poll. So this is where it started its operations because it was going to take time to build a building for this institution. Jean, let's go to slide 30. This actually shows Carpenter's Hall from one of my favorite vantage points in the city of Philadelphia. This is from Chestnut Street, looking towards the hall. The two buildings on either side, on the left and the right, are actually recreations. Carpenter's Hall is an 18th century building, but this is one of the very few purely 18th century views or vistas in the entire city of Philadelphia, so a really great place to get a sense as to what it would look like in the 18th century. Let's go to the next slide. The first Bank of the United States was designed by Blodgett, and so this is a great drawing of the outside of the building. It was a Roman Revival building. Of course, during the very early years of the United States, the idea of the Roman Republic was something that was strong in the political thinkings of the day, and so they were designing buildings that were Roman Revival style. Let's go to the next slide. This is a picture of the building roughly today. This is actually one of my own photographs. So you can see that the exterior is well preserved. I should mention to you that the inside of the building was significantly altered in 1903, and so the original interior is no longer inside this building. But it's still a really fantastic 18th century building. Later in its life, and I'll show some pictures of this, it's been a number of different things. Let's go to the next slide. This is actually our group of teachers on the left leaving the building during one of our summer courses for teachers. So if you're interested, you can certainly sign up and come to our Making Sense of Money and Banking course. It's in the third week in July, and actually registration is available right now on our website, philadelphiafed.org/education. A really fantastic facade on this building. Let's go to the next slide. one of the things I should really point out is this very early representation of the American eagle, this great carved eagle that's in the pediment of this building, just a really fantastic view of the American eagle. Let's go to the next slide. And again, this is just a close-up that I took of the great Corinthian columns on this Roman Revival building. On to the next slide. This building is a great building to really read about. You read the exterior of this building and understand a bit about what the story is that this building's trying to tell. And so it's very clearly a bank building. You see Mercury in two different images, one over the door and then in this this motif that's even higher over the front door. That's Mercury. You see some ships there. So clearly this bank is involved in the United States' international trade. You see Mercury's net there, which is filled with coins. And you see the globe there, that Mercury and banking is sort of over the globe or involved with the entire globe. So really great imagery on the front of this building showing a lot about what this building was all about. And, of course, the exteriors of buildings in this period were important. The design of the building was important in terms of conveying a lot about the institution. Let's go on to the next slide. There's another close-up that I took of that great carved eagle. And then also these fasces that are over the door, which is, of course, the fasces was something that would have been carried in front of either the Roman emperor or his representative or governor, and so they're actually shown in this building over the windows, showing the role of the government in this, that this is the government's bank, that this is a bank that is the holder of the government's deposits. Let's go on to the next slide. One great publication, if you want to read a lot more about these buildings and these institutions, is to look at an article that was published in the Winterthur Portfolio a few years ago. This is Banking Houses in the United States. And so I've given you actually the reference there on slide 38 to this actual publication, Banking Houses in the U.S. So I do not have this in the live binder because it is a copyrighted article, but you can actually go out to the library, what have you, and get this, a great article that's available on banking houses and their design. And actually in that publication are a few photographs of what the first bank in the United States looked like inside before the renovations were completed in 1903 by the Girard Bank. Go to the next slide. We talked a little bit about those branches, and again, I think one of the things that I certainly didn't understand when I was in high school was the real role of the First Bank of the United States across the country. I really thought about it. I knew about the fact that people were opposed to its because of some centralized authority that it had certainly over the economy and its influence over the economy as a whole. But I think I was left with the impression that that meant it was just here in Philadelphia and that there was no place else that you could interact with this institution. But the important thing is that they had these offices of discount or deposit, what we would call branches, at various places throughout the country. And so this actually shows the Bank of New York on the left, and the New York branch of the Bank of the United States being the third building from the left. So the rightmost before that tree. So this is an engraving, a watercoloring that shows that branch in New York. Let's go to the next slide. The next slide actually has the Charleston branch, which is now part of Charleston City Hall. And so this was the branch of the bank, the first bank of the United States in Charleston. See, again, you see similar architecture to the home bank here in Philadelphia. Let's go to the next slide. This is a picture of the First Bank building in 1844. It's actually an early daguerreotype. So you get to see this building in another use. At that time, it actually was a bank building, and it had been purchased when the First Bank of the United States closed in 1811. And you will recall that it closed because its charter was not renewed. The building was bought by a Philadelphia banker, Stephen Girard, and so here is actually showing the building in its next life as part of the Girard Bank. Let's go to the next slide. By 1939, and I always think this is a very grim-looking photograph here on slide 42 of the First Bank of the United States building, and actually the sign over the door says American Legion, and until I actually saw this photograph, I didn't realize that the building had actually become the American Legion post for a while. And you'll notice the density of buildings that are nearby and around this building. So this was an area in Old City, Philadelphia that was quite built up, certainly by the 1930s. Let's go to the next slide. And this is what the First Bank of the United States looked like in 1974. And so you'll see that many of the non-18th century buildings have been torn down all around the First Bank of the United States. Across the street, you see the construction of the Visitor Center for Independence Park. Off in the distance at the very top of the photograph, you can see Independence Hall. You can also see the Second Bank of the United States. It's a very light gray there up towards the upper right-hand quadrant of the photograph. Today, that visitor center is gone, and we're looking forward to the building, the new museum, the Museum of the American Revolution, that is under construction today. Let's go on to the next slide. So let's just emphasize the fact that the Bank of the United States was not a central bank in the modern sense. The country didn't have very many banks, but the Bank of the United States was large. It had broad geographic presence, so it had presence throughout the country. And changes in its lending policies would influence the lending policies of state banks. We saw a significant explosion of these state charter banks over the time that the First Bank of the United States was in existence. So going from 5 state charter banks in 1792 all the way up to 101 state charter banks by 1811. Let's go to the next slide. This is just another little bit that's actually from our First Bank of the United States lesson. And in there I've actually put some letters from Plymouth Bill, who was a securities trader here in Philadelphia. And so you can see examples of those over on the right. This is admittedly a hard activity, but it gives an opportunity, if you're looking for an opportunity to get students engaged in some 18th century research or looking at some 18th century documents. This is a typed version of what is comes from his letter book. Let's go to the next slide. Another thing that we do in that First Bank lesson is give actually some cards where we have the students look at what it would be like being in a state chartered bank and interacting with the First Bank of the United States. So I'll talk in a minute about how it was that the First Bank could influence the lending practices of the state banks. But what happens is you divide your students into groups. In each group, they get a card in the first round, and they have to calculate how many banknotes they could issue, put out in their loan-making process, given the amount of gold and silver coin that they have in their vaults. So this is the round 1 card for the Pennsylvania State Chartered Bank. Let's go to the next slide. This is the round 2 card. And so what's actually happened is that the state charter banks now no longer have as much gold and silver coin in their branch, in their vaults, and so therefore are not able to issue as many banknotes. So, Gene, we should be on slide 47. And we're actually going to go on to 48. They actually work now in groups then to complete for their different banks, complete a little ledger form about the maximum number of banknotes that they could actually issue given the amount of specie that they have on hand, gold and silver coin. Let's go to the next slide. So let's just dig a little bit into explaining to you how it is that the First Bank could actually influence state bank lending. So realize that all banks took in deposits of gold and silver coins as well as paper banknotes. Banknotes came into circulation through the loan-making process. So if you went and you got a loan for your business, you would actually be given banknotes that were convertible on demand into gold and silver coin, and then they would circulate. Those banknotes circulated as money. Depositors could then deposit those state banknotes in any bank, but let's say that they deposited them in the First Bank of the United States, or at the time, as it was called, the Bank of the United States. And what the first bank could do is to store those banknotes in their vaults. Hang on to those state-chartered banknotes. Now, as long as they're hanging on to those state-chartered banknotes, that means they're not being converted into gold and silver coins. So, in other words, the gold and silver coin that's backing those banknotes is staying in the state-chartered bank's vaults. But if the first bank wanted to tighten credit conditions, it could do so by presenting the state banknotes from its vault to those state banks for payment in gold and silver. And that, in turn, would reduce the amount of gold and silver that were in the vaults of the state banks and therefore make it harder for them to make loans, harder for them to issue more banknotes, and then credit conditions across the country would tighten. But it's important to emphasize that it's not the case that modern monetary policy was being created. That's not the case. But the first bank could and did influence the availability of credit in the country and did influence the ability of state banks to lend by whether or not the first bank held on to state banknotes or whether they presented them in exchange for gold and silver coin. Some other things about the first bank. The first bank was not a lender of last resort. It was not doing bank supervision like we know happens with many modern central banks like the Federal Reserve System today. But in so many ways, it was a large bank. It was a large national bank. And so sometimes we call it our first central bank. We go on to the next slide. So, Gene, before we get into talking about the War of 1812, we want to mention the fact that the First Bank of the United States did not get a charter renewal in 1811. It failed in both houses of Congress. The act to recharter, the bill to recharter, failed in both houses by one vote. But before we go on to talk about what happened after the First Bank of the United States closed, maybe we can see if there's some questions that are out there.
All right, thanks, Andrew. If you would like to submit a question to Andrew, you can click that Ask Question button in the webinar tool and type your question in. I'll get it queued up for Andrew. At this time, though, I'll just pause for a second or two to see if someone was trying to type their question in the moment. I don't see any questions for now, Andrew, so I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay. So the War of 1812 ended in late 1814. And the country was in essentially the same exact shape it had been in at the end of the Revolutionary War. The government had significant war debt and not necessarily the easiest ways to fund it, and there were significant amounts of inflation because a lot of paper currency had been printed and put out there in order to be able to fund the war effort. So lots of prominent financiers at the time, Astor, Barker, Calhoun, Dallas, Gerard, Parrish, they all supported the idea of bringing back another Bank of the United States. There was significant debate for a number of years, and then the war ends, and Madison really thinks that there's no need for a second bank. And I should emphasize the fact that in the early days, when we were talking about Hamilton versus Jefferson, Madison was a person who opposed the first Bank of the United States. But again, the government winds up with this war debt. Madison rejects a number of bank bills, but finally in 1816 he signs a bill to create the Second Bank of the United States. Sometimes you hear people say recharter the Bank of the United States, but these really are two different institutions. The First Bank of the United States had gone away. There was now a bill to create a new institution also called the Bank of the United States. So I don't really go for the idea of saying that they're rechartering. Really, it's a completely new institution. It winds up with a completely new building, as we'll talk about in a moment. Let's go on to the next slide. So we've created, as part of our Federal Reserve and You project, again, that's the 71-clip video project that's available on our YouTube site, and you can also order a DVD of it. We've created a segment. It's actually segment 202. It's in Chapter 2, the History of Central Banking segment, on the Second Bank of the United States. And this is a pretty modern picture of what the Second Bank of the United States looks like today. And that statue that's there on the left is actually Robert Morris, a prominent financier in the United States in the early days. So let's go on to the next slide. But there you can see where you can actually access this clip. And again, through the live binder that I've mentioned, I've made the clip available. We've also produced a print publication that's available in free class sets. It's also available as a PDF on our website that you can download. on the second bank of the United States. We haven't written a lesson to go with this yet, but that's something that certainly is in our list of things we want to do, is to write a lesson that goes along with this as well. But this is another great print publication that you can use in your classes and assign to your students to get them to understand a bit more about what the second bank was all about. Let's go on to the next slide. So a lot of the things you're going to see here on this next slide are very similar to what we had with the First Bank of the United States. It was also a private institution. The stock was publicly traded, but in this case, the foreign stockholders could not vote. Like other banks, the second bank makes business loans, it accepts deposits, it issues notes that circulate as currency and are also convertible into gold and silver coin, just like any other bank in the country. It had a larger capitalization, in this case $35 million, larger than the First Bank of the United States, but it took a considerable amount more to capitalize this bank. People rushed to capitalize the First Bank of the United States. That was not the case with the Second Bank of the United States. It took quite a long time, and the United States government was a larger backer of the institution by the end. Let's go on to the next slide. Just like the First Bank of the United States, the Second Bank of the United States was the fiscal agent of the United States. It received its revenues, it held its deposits, it made its payments. It was just like the First Bank. It was headquartered here in Philadelphia, and it eventually had 25 branches throughout the country. Again, it helped to support growing international trade, and it also was engaged in supporting westward expansion. So while the branch locations did not necessarily move out to the territories, they weren't building branches in territories, there was no question that the Second Bank was engaged in providing credit that helped to allow for westward expansion, plus the fact as the fiscal agent of the United States, it was also the place in which the deposits from land sales, funds from land sales were deposited into the federal government's accounts in the Second Bank of the United States. Let's go on to the next slide. So here's a list of the branch locations that it opened with, and you'll see that some of them were discontinued and reopened. They're certainly much more inland than they were for the First Bank in the United States. We're not just talking about port cities now. We're talking about offices of discounted deposit that are much further into the west, moving westward in the United States. Let's go on to the next slide. So eventually 8 more branches were opened. These were in Mobile, Alabama, and Nashville, Tennessee, Portland, Maine, Buffalo, New York, St. Louis, Missouri, Burlington, Vermont, Utica, New York, and Natchez, Mississippi. So in the end, we had branches located in 20 states plus the District of Columbia. So again, an institution that, while it was headquartered here in Philadelphia, was did have a broad geographic reach, as had the First Bank of the United States. So, Gene, we should be on slide 57 now. So on slide 57, I've actually shown Carpenter's Hall, and you say, well, why did he put up that again? Did he wind up making a mistake in his PowerPoint presentation and wind up putting up the same building again? No. The Second Bank of the United States didn't have a building, and you say, well, why didn't it move back into the First Bank's building? Well, that building had been bought by Stephen Girard and was being used as a bank, as his bank. So the Second Bank of the United States, it also moved into Carpenter's Hall in order to start its operations until its building could be built. Let's move on to the next slide. And the person who was given the responsibility of designing the Second Bank of the United States building was William Strickland, a very famous American architect. And there in this painting of Strickland, you actually see the First Bank of the United States facade behind him. Let's go on to the next slide. And this is a picture of the Second Bank of the United States today, and you'll see that this is a Greek Revival building. So by the time in 1816, 1817, into the 1820s, the U.S. really recognizes that the kind of democracy that it wants to model itself off of is more the Greek kind, not what happened to the Roman Republic. And so this is the Second Bank of the United States building, much larger building, but here again, still able to be seen here in Philadelphia. This is actually the portrait gallery of Independence National Historical Park. If you come to Philadelphia, I consider this to be one of the great hidden gems in the city of Philadelphia, which is to come and to see the excellent collection of Charles Wilson Peale portraits, but other portraits of early Americans, many of them painted from life. It's a real treasure. And the other thing that's really excellent about this building, and again, we take teachers there during our Making Sense of Money and Banking course, is that you can actually see the banking floor's layout in this building when you go in it today. So despite the fact that it's the portrait gallery, you can see how the building was laid out when it was being used as a bank. Let's go on to the next slide. So just like with the first bank, you can actually go into and see some actual locations where the second bank's branches were located. This is one in New Orleans. This is at 343 Royal Street, and I was just there last month, actually, and walked by. And so this is the location where the second bank did its operations back in those days. It's an antique store today. Let's go on to the next slide. This is a great facade. I haven't actually had a chance to go up and see this one myself, but this is the facade of the New York branch of the Second Bank of the United States, and it's in the MoMA in New York City. So you can go to an art museum and then see a little bit about banking history as well. So a great opportunity to get to see a little bit of the remaining fabric of this early institution. Let's go on to the next slide. Here's the second bank's branch in Charleston. So we had seen the first bank's branch. Now we're seeing the second bank's branch, and you see that great big eagle there as well up at the top of that building. Let's go on to the next slide. So I want to point out again, just like I did for the first bank, that this was not a central bank in the modern sense, right? It was not a lender of last resort. It was not doing banking supervision or things like that. But its large size, again, and how big its geographic presence was, had a big influence over the economy as a whole. And again, just like with the first bank, when it changed its lending policies, it could influence state charter banks as well. So the number of state charter banks since 1816, when it was first chartered, were 205. By 1836, when its charter expired, excuse me, there were 563 state charter banks in the United States. Let's go on to the next slide. Perhaps the thing that people remember the most about the second bank in the United States was the significant battle that took place between Nicholas Biddle, the bank's last president, and Andrew Jackson. So Jackson really opposed this bank. He opposed all banks in so many ways. He had had some bad banking experiences. And so the opponents of the bank, and they tended to be, the opponents of both of these institutions tended to be farmers and small business people, people who relied heavily on credit, excuse me, and wanted to be able to see lower interest rates, more availability of credit. And so they were they felt very positively about the work that state charter banks did in making credit available nationwide. So when Andrew Jackson becomes president, he was a significant, powerful ally now for those people who opposed the bank. The debate came to a head, really, though, in the election of 1832, when Jackson vetoed the bill for the early recharter of this institution. And that rechartering bill had been supported by his opponent, Henry Clay. Jackson wins the election and then transfers the U.S. government's funds to state-chartered banks. And that happened roughly in 1833. And then after the bank's charter runs out in 1836, we really don't wind up having central banking or anything that looks anything like it revived for over 75 years until the founding of the Federal Reserve System. I should mention just briefly that the Second Bank of the United States did have some significant malfeasance that took place on the part of its directors and officers in its very early days. But by the time that Biddle had come along, he was extremely efficient at running this institution, and the institution had really turned around in terms of being a model of a bank, or a very good bank at the time. The difficulty here, of course, was that both Biddle and Jackson were very stubborn people, and they were both really out to push their point no matter what. And, of course, Biddle had little chance probably of winning against the President of the United States. Let's go on to the next slide. One of the questions you might have is, well, okay, so the U.S. government moved its money out of what really was its bank, the Bank of the United States, and put it into state-chartered banks. Some of those banks actually failed. And the result was in 1836, Congress started asking for financial reports to be filed with the Treasury. Then in 1846, it established what was called the independent Treasury system around the country in order to hold its deposits and to really act as the fiscal agent in so many ways. Sub-Treasury offices were then located throughout the country. Eventually, there were 11 of them. They actually wound up being less important after the creation of the national banking system at the middle point of the Civil War, and then the last one closed in 1921, well after the founding of the Federal Reserve System in 1913. But really the Federal Reserve wound up being obviously the fiscal agent of the United States government. Let's go on to the next slide. So if you're interested in the period after the closing of the Second Bank of the United States, you might look at our clip on the state and national banking periods. This is also available on YouTube and on our website as part of the Federal Reserve and You project. And we actually go on to then later periods in that history chapter as well. I just am not highlighting them here in this webinar. Let's go on to the next slide. We've also produced a print publication on the state and national banking eras, as well as a print publication on the creation of the Federal Reserve and the Federal Reserve's first 100 years. So this whole series of history publications are available to you in class sets that you can use with your students. And eventually we hope to write lessons that will go along with each and every one of these. Go on to the next slide. If you're particularly interested in the early days, the founding of the first Bank of the United States and the early folks, and really Philadelphia's role as our first Wall Street all the way up until the closing of the Second Bank of the United States in 1836, two excellent books, both with Robert Wright as the author. One is Founding Fathers, and the other is The First Wall Street, which really describes all these institutions that were located along Chestnut Street here in Philadelphia. So I just want to emphasize, let's go on to the next slide, Gene. As we're wrapping up here, I just want to emphasize to you that as long as you were logged into the webinar on your computer, it's logged your participation. And in a couple days, we'll be able to send you via email a professional development certificate for the hour you've spent with us here on this webinar. So I really want to thank everyone for participating in this. I hope I've given you a little bit more information about both of these institutions, some things that you can add in terms of content to your classes, but also that you'll go out to the Live Binder or to our website and check out the video clips and the print publications and the lessons that we've prepared so that you can use those in your classroom as well. So, Gene, I'm going to turn it back to you and find out if there's any questions.
Thanks so much, Andrew. All right, we did have a couple of questions roll in right after we broke for questions earlier. So the first couple relate to the First Bank, so I'll start with those. When the First Bank lost its charter, what happened to the resources?
Well, a really interesting thing that we found a few years ago in our library here at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, there was actually a document that was prepared for shareholders. One of the things that the shareholders as well as the officers of the First Bank really did was ask for some more time. They said, you know, we're going to have to unwind the First Bank of the United States, and that's going to, or the Bank of the United States, and that's going to take time. And there was disruption. It was not an easy process. Think about unwinding a bank in a very short period of time. And so that publication actually, or that document actually gives some idea as to what was supposed to happen and how the shares were supposed to be distributed and paid off. But really they were decapitalizing a corporation, and people had to get their deposits back out, and then also there was loans to be repaid. So it was not an easy process. One of the things that I think we all wish is that we had more of the records, like, again, of the First Bank. Those records, those ledgers are no longer available, and if anybody ever finds those will be one of the great treasures of central banking history. Will be to be able to find those ledgers, but all evidence seems to be that they were destroyed.
Okay, thanks for that. And you may have already answered this, but I will ask the question nonetheless. Why did they not recharter the First Bank, then charter another one?
Well, really, they were two institutions, and I think a lot had come from what I just said. The first one had been completely taken apart. Its shareholders had gone. The deposits and the banknotes and all that stuff from the first bank, as well as its building, were gone. And I think also there were memories of what had happened at the end of the first bank. Now, then the question is, why also call it the Bank of the United States? And I don't know the answer to that. So, but they were clearly two different charters, two different institutions, two different sets of buildings. As you can see, they wound up with a completely different set of physical structures throughout the country. And that was because those buildings had been sold off and in the intervening period were being used for other things.
Okay, so someone asked, so what happened to the money that was in the First National Bank?
Okay, so if you would deposit your money, you would then go and get your money back out again, just like you would withdraw your funds from a bank today. The issue is you also have loans that are outstanding, and so there had to be some unwinding of that. And again, I don't know all of the details of how that happened, and I think that there's also some lack of knowledge of exactly what all the details were for the unwinding of the institution, because again, the banking records are not present any longer. But we have some idea of the fact that clearly loans had to be repaid, and then also people had to have their deposits paid out to them.
Okay, I'm going to try to squeeze just one more question in. Have you seen anything indicating that Daniel Webster was on the second bank's payroll?
Well, I don't know that. I would have to look that up. I don't know that.
Okay, sounds good. Well, I did also get a comment in here. Thanks so much. Very interesting. I'm eager to read more about this, so kudos to you, Andrew. Andrew, we have reached our time. Do you have any closing remarks before I close out our call today?
I just want to thank everyone for joining us on this webinar, and I hope that you'll connect with us in the future, either for a webinar or come to Philadelphia and come to one of our training programs. So thank you very much, and we'll get those certificates out to you in the coming days.
All right, Andrew, thanks for that, and thank you to our participants for joining today. You may have, if you joined us in the webinar, you probably saw the link pop up. That's a link to our survey. We'll also send an email. You only have to respond once, but we would love to hear your feedback. Have a great day, everyone.